Hey students, this is video number 2 for sustainable agriculture. So we're going to switch a little bit now to animals, and we talked a little bit about irrigation, and we talked about how agriculture has changed from the beginning with hunter-gatherers to traditional and then to industrial. And then we also talked a little bit about the Green Revolution and how it was both beneficial and harmful in many ways. So we want to focus specifically on animals because they're another way that we impact the environment through our food. And what do you notice in this graph here? Well, this is a graph of the per person global production of meat and seafood. And what you notice is a general trend going from the 1960s up to today of an increase in both meat and seafood. Again, 1950s where we had the Green Revolution, this is again an uptick. So we have a five-fold increase or growth since the 1960s. We have a lot of consequences as a result of what we eat. Every time one organism consumes another, we only get about 10% of the energy going up each trophic level. If you remember from the beginning of the year, we start with 100 units of energy on the bottom. The next level is only 10 units. The next level is 1 unit. The next level is 1/10 of 1 unit. And so it behooves us, or it's in our own interest, to save energy by eating lower on the food chain. In other words, eating more vegetables and fruits, or even going all vegetarian. It's much more of an efficient way of ingesting calories, and it has a much lower ecological footprint. As you can see here, some animals convert food better than others. You'll notice that the cow is all the way at the top. It is needing 20 kilograms for every 1 kilogram of beef it produces, whereas milking a cow requires essentially the exact same energy input as output. Chickens are down there on the bottom, and eggs, and then pork, and then finally, again, cows at the top. Other graphs that are really important for us to understand is the land required, the emissions, the water required. All of them are showing that beef is just by large the worst way of getting energy. So what can we do? Well, what's a baby step? We can just reduce the amount of red meat that we're eating, or again, go vegetarian. So this really decreases the CO2 produced in the atmosphere, and animal agriculture accounts for about 14.5% of all greenhouse gases. It's more than driving. So how do we do this? How do we do livestock and animal farming now? Right now, what we do is something called feedlots or CAFOs, confined animal feeding operations. I'll say CAFOs to be short. These are large pens, often with very low light and high density of these animals. They're given a really high energy feed so that it helps them grow really quickly. Benefits are that it's much more economically efficient to have this many organisms growing in a very small area. It also reduces the grazing impact of these animals. But it also produces a lot of intense pollution, as you can imagine, the density of these organisms producing high concentrated waste. Rich nitrogen and phosphorus contributing to eutrophication if it runs off into a water source, and also containing bacterial and viral pathogens. Hormones, antibiotics, and other drugs are also given to these animals just to keep them healthy, and more so because they're in higher densities. The higher the density of population, even for humans, the higher risk of spread of disease we can clearly see in this area. Another way of growing food, particularly organisms that we eat, not plants, are fish and scallops and other things that grow in the ocean or in fresh water. This is aquaculture, and because of the plummeting of the wild fish populations due to the tragedy of the commons, we have been developing what's called aquaculture, being able to cultivate these organisms in controlled environments. Now, you might think a controlled environment like a tank. Well, it's not necessarily true. We can actually have a controlled environment, but in the same exact river that they're normally naturally found in. It might just be a netted area, but it still has the same nutrients and same water flow that they're normally accustomed to. Lots of animals and organisms are being grown through aquaculture. Fish, obviously, being about half, but then we have aquatic plants and mollusks like clams and mussels, crustaceans like crabs and such. It has, again, like anything in environmental science, benefits and costs. Obviously, we're increasing the total food production and protein for, particularly for people who have problems with food security. It also helps to reduce overfishing of wild fish, so we don't have to rely on wild fish as much. And it reduces what we call bycatch. If you remember, bycatch is what we get um, as uh, something that we don't want, but we might drag up in the net, like a sea turtle when we're trying to get, tuna. Large scale, though, industrial aquaculture, you have to use antibiotics. Again, large scale means high density, and so close, organisms means that they're passing, you know, um, diseases from one to the next. You could potentially decrease the amount of nutrients and natural organisms in the water, so it could potentially destroy coastal ecosystems. You could also be spreading invasive species if you farm the organisms and they escape and they weren't native of that particular area. So you have to be careful of that. Um, the first actual genetically modified organism that was allowed or approved by the FDA was a salmon. And as you can see here, the wild type versus the genetically modified is much larger. So it's going to give more protein. Um, we, with all of this in genetically modified organisms, we've been talking about those, there is eventually this concern that you might actually run out of the original source of the DNA. And so we are right now preserving crop diversity and organism diversity and pollinators as much as possible. But about 90% of our food consumed now comes from just only 15 crop species and 8 livestock species. It's unbelievable. This is a huge decrease. It's a single catastrophic, uh, I'm sorry, because of the fact that we have very few organisms that we're eating right now in terms of its diversity. If a disease wipes out, even a few of them, it would be catastrophic. Um, Hundreds of what we call land races have been bred in Mexico, as it said down here. It's to help preserve locally adapted varieties or land races. In Mexico, we have wild maize and thousands of different potatoes in the Andes Mountains. Um, and we also have places that are really protected, like seed banks, which looks like kind of a doomsday bunker. This is in Arctic Norway, which very few sort of diseases or viruses can get there and survive, and it's well protected, so that's good. And it's literally a bank of seeds that um, represents the genetic diversity we have. Other things we have to preserve are the pollinators. The pollinators are so important. It's estimated that honeybees and other insects do about $15 billion a year in terms of their pollinator services, right? So if we were to put a price tag on that ecosystem service, $15 billion. And yet we're seeing this huge decrease in North American bees all over the place. Um, and some possible sources of this decline is the insecticide application increasing with direct mortality. So spraying the insecticide immediately kills the bees, or introducing parasites and pathogens as a result of globalization. And we're spreading diseases and parasites all the time. And finally, habitat and flower loss due to herbicides on farms, lawns, and just general habitat destruction. So what we have is what we call colony collapse disorder, or CCD. CCD is a phrase that we use to describe what's happened, which is a third of all honeybees um, are dying each year as a result of this. And there is believed to be a combination of reasons for that, as we said in the prior slide. What can we do? We can plant buffer strips of wildflowers between our monocrops to help attract pollinators and help us pollinate our crops. You can put them along highways. You've probably seen them if you've been on long drives on 95 or I-80 across Pennsylvania. In the middle, in the median, you see these wildflowers. Not very often. We need more. And you can pollinate, or you can plant pollinator plants too. Milkweed is great for butterflies.